Hi class, welcome to week 11. So week 11 is probably right around that time where most people really start thinking about the research paper. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of that housekeeping now. I'm posting in week 11, which right after I post this will make available to you guys. And I'll also put in an announcement. Informed consent forms, examples of those will need to be signed by your interviewees. Do not turn those in to me. They're supposed to be anonymous. However, you need to sign them just so that it's basically kind of like a waiver for interviews. Um, if you are looking at doing interviews or events around sensitive subjects, you're going to want to check in with me. I don't recommend, to be honest, I'm much more in the guise of observing a soccer game and looking at sports rituals, right? Like that's kind of more in the realm of things. Shopping, looking at entertainment culture, those kinds of things as well. So informed consent forms are going to be up. The rubric for how the paper will be graded will be up. Again, we're moving into November, so we're looking at a month left for the research paper. And I'm just now starting to get questions and inquiries about that paper. So that will all be available in week 11. All right, so for week 11's content, we're looking at language and culture. In terms of human communication, there's big debate whether or not communication is the reason why humans have language, or was it thought and internal thought being and ideas and perceptions being the most important in terms of creation of language. A lot of times, in one of the debates on it not being necessarily used for communication is misinterpretations and how much communication can go wrong when we don't use the right words, or there's misunderstandings because people have different views of maybe what words mean to them. So anyway, in terms of like just kind of housekeeping around language and definitions, communications process of sending and receiving meaningful messages, aka symbols. Language is a systemic set of learned symbols and signs among group passed on generation to generation. Productivity, people are able to communicate a potentially infinite number of messages efficiently. So this is the key. I think in your TED Talk video that I have you watching, the expert on language describes this kind of more in depth. Call systems, communication among non-human primates with various meaningful sounds. Call systems are definitely, we're starting to analyze those more in the field, and they are much more complicated than we originally thought. When kind of grunts and almost barks in the primate world, those, we're not able to pick up the different tones, but really what these primates are doing is using very, very descriptive language. Displacement, a feature of human language whereby people are able to talk about events in the past and present. So this is the idea that we kind of have past tense, present tense, and future tense. I will tell you that not all language have past tense or future tense. And again, so this gets into kind of what we'll get into when we talk about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in terms of language determining thought. If we don't have a future tense language or past tense language, how can we even talk about those things? We might be able to think about tomorrow, but in terms of describing what we think is going to happen tomorrow to other people, if we don't have a future tense, this becomes much more complicated. Big data, millions of data points gathered from the internet, cell phones, Facebook, and tweeting. This is becoming more of a language point as well. Again, communication has changed a lot, I would say, in the last 20 years for sure, in terms of social media and cell phone usage. Formal properties of language. These are symbols that linguists can use to basically utilize to represent phonemes or sounds that different languages are using. Lexicon is another word for vocabulary. Syntax is grammar. And a lot of times, again, when we talk about what separates humans from primates, we talk about language. Lexicon, vocabulary. Primates have a large vocabulary, especially the great apes, when we teach them American Sign Language. They're more concerned with primates not having syntax or grammar in terms of being able to use the future tense and past tense and stuff like that when we're talking about separating humans from primates. But more and more of these studies are being done. So it's kind of hard to determine whether or not this is totally accurate or not. Ethnosemantics, study of meaning or of words, phrases, and sentences, in particular sign language, cultural contexts. So again, ethnosemantics this could be different uses of words and terms in different languages and different culture groups. Body language would also be interpreted differently in different groups as well. So like last week, I am the video lecture is probably going to be shorter this week, just because I have you guys reading a lot and doing a lot, and you are going to move into the research paper. So I do want the discussion around the research paper to kind of continue in that way. And please email me as much as you need to in terms of clarification of the research paper while we're talking about communication and language, right? Nonverbal language. This is an interesting kind of side picture here. Defensive standing position. The person with their arms folded. It's interesting that we interpret these things sometimes. I find myself folding my arms in situations, not because I'm feeling defensive, but more that maybe I don't know what to do with my arms and my hands. And what if we grew up in a religious context and folding our arms was a symbol of reverence? So again, I think that symbols can be interpreted different ways, but again, I think that psychologists kind of just put these blanket statements on things, and they're not always true because culture to culture, they're very different. Closed body and closed attitude. Again, these two men kind of standing off with their arms closed, both of them mirroring. This tends to happen as well. Humans do a lot of mimicry around body language, and you can observe this if you're talking to somebody and you fold your arms, a lot of times the other person will do it as well. Again, I don't know. I guess there's something about if both people have their arms closed, then there's less of a power kind of situation going on there. I think that when you have open body and open attitude, like those poses, some people open themselves up to using that structure as power over other people in conversation. And this goes back to kind of our power discussion earlier. Sign language, communication that mainly uses hand movements to convey messages. Silence is a form of language as well. Relates to status, like in Siberia, where the daughter-in-law is not allowed to speak to other members of the family. So silence is also a form of nonverbal language. And again, some people, even in our culture, right, they have a really, really hard time with silence and fill the void of not talking with talking. Even though some people might actually value the silence and in terms of their kind of language construct. Clothing and hairstyles is also a version of nonverbal language. Body modification, so that's tattoos, piercings, scarification, those kinds of things are also nonverbal language. Proxemics is fascinating. It is the study of human spacing. So kind of think of our bubble, right? In New York, we don't have a bubble on the subway. In California, where we have more land or we're rural, we have more of a bubble. People don't invade space as much. This has a lot to do with even teacher-student relationship, where the teacher's standing up and the student's sitting down. The teacher could be getting close to a student, and this could either symbolize the teacher trying to exert power over that individual, or the closeness could also represent in a desire to do some kind of micro educating, like extra help, tutoring, those kinds of things. That's also seen as bridging that bubble is seen as sometimes threatening in terms of a power role, but also it can be viewed as a closeness of relationship and building rapport. Communication with media and tech, critical media anthropology. This is a newer kind of field. It really is going to look at what degree is media freeing or controlling, and whose interests the media serves. So this is really analyzing media in general from an anthropological perspective, which is what is the verbiage and, what is the grammar, who's doing the speaking, what does their body language look like. All of these things really end up kind of having a place in this critical media anthropology. Journalism, a lot of times anthropologists end up um, becoming journalists, at least in the undergrad level. Journalists can kind of behave like anthropologists, and when you start to do your research paper, you'll start to realize that and doing your interviews and having them sign informed consent forms and stuff like that, that's much more journalistic approach. Journalists tend to be, I would say, more like parachute anthropologists, which is really quick, really fast, just trying to get the story. Um, Story versus shedding light on a cultural phenomenon are really differences and separate the world of journalism and anthropology. Anthropology is much more in depth. You know, anthropologists tend to spend years of their life with a specific group trying to inform phenomenon, whereas journalists tend to go in and try to just get a story. Like if there's a hurricane, they want to know the impacts of the hurricane, kind of tell their story and get out and go home. Anthropologists are much more concerned about what that hurricane does for a longer period of time, like a year or 2 years, the impact that it might have on individuals, how it changes their culture, how the culture adapts and overcomes, and those kinds of things. So that should be some separation in your mind. Advertising in the U.S., anthropologists, I would say that corporate psychologists or consumer psychologists are really revolutionized the era of advertising and what really started to sell. And when they started to put kind of cultural heroes associated with products, it really started to move product, and advertising started to skyrocket and really just move kind of the market, especially the free market in America, and consumerism in this whole other direction. The digital divide is social inequality and access to new and emerging IT. This is kind of information technology. Again, some people can afford computers, cell phones, and other tech. Some people can't. Some people are older and are not used to tech because they did not grow up with it. This is all part of the digital divide. All right, language and culture. There's some theories here that you're going to definitely want to know. Big hints going into the language category. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that language determines thought, which determines behavior. I'm going to have you read a lot on this. It's debated, and it's debated because Sapir-Whorf is just one aspect of the idea, right? So if language determines thought, determines behavior, right? So if I don't have words that I'm using, I can't actually think of concepts without those words because I think in language, my language, which is English, right? So if I don't have those words, I can't actually think of those concepts. And the one that we usually use is Japan not having the word for romantic love. So them not being able to totally understand what romantic love is because it's not in their language, it's not in their syntax or their lexicon historically. So that is language determines thought and cultural behavior. Now, sociolinguistics is that piece that's going to complete that circle, which is culture and society and social position determine language. So here's the piece where, let's say that a new technology is invented, but we don't have a word for it, like texting. Well, society will invent a word, and then it will then play into our Sapir-Whorf, and now we can actually build that concept inside of our heads through description. So there's a full circle here. Like your brain requires language to think, but then society creates new words for us to think with. So think of it as a full circle. So really what we have is Sapir-Whorf and sociolinguistics. Language is a fascinating thing. Without language, we can perceive things, but they might not be what society deems correct. So this is where you're going to get into psychology versus kind of anthropology, and then there's a bridge, which is psychological anthropology. I had a very good discussion with a professor of psychology here at Syracuse, and we were basically discussing kind of this phenomenon of individuals being able to perceive concepts and have semi-understandings, lumping. But the one thing here is that individuals can have them, but they don't become solidified until the culture or society determines whether or not that you have that concept down. So basically, culture and society act as our sound wall to make sure that we are conceptually agreeing upon ideas. And this goes back to the formation of self and George Herbert Mead and our interplay with others to determine whether or not we are kind of selves. And really that has everything to do with language as well.